The Wexford estate holds secrets darker than the shadows cast by its towering walls. A daughter, once cherished, now erased from family portraits and whispered conversations. Time cannot bury what truly deserves to be remembered. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of Wexford Estate's east wing, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Eleanor Blackridge adjusted her dust mask and squinted at the crumbling plaster before her. 23 years of architectural preservation work had taught her to read buildings like texts, and this one whispered of secrets. "Professor, I think I found something," called Jacob Moreno, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. The graduate student was balanced precariously on a stepladder, examining a section of warped wooden paneling that seemed oddly out of place against the Victorian wallpaper. Eleanor made her way carefully across the uneven floorboards. "Be careful with that. Remember, we document before we disturb." Jacob nodded, already snapping photos with his smartphone. The wood grain doesn't match the surrounding panels. It's like someone made a repair or concealed something. Maya Chu looked up from her conservation notes. "The estate records don't mention any renovations to this section after 1927, she said, her skepticism evident in her tone. With Eleanor's reluctant permission, Jacob wedged his pry bar gently behind the panel. The wood groaned, then gave way with a sudden crack. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. A massive, ornate frame came crashing down, hitting the floor with a thunderous impact that sent decades of dust and startled mice scattering in all directions. "Everyone back!" Eleanor commanded, heart pounding as she approached the fallen object. It was a portrait frame, blackened with age and sealed shut, its surface crusted with grime and cobwebs. The conservation expert rushed forward with gloved hands, carefully turning the frame to examine its back. Maya's usually composed expression faltered. "There's an inscription," she whispered. Eleanor knelt beside her colleague, brushing away dust to reveal 3 words etched into the wood: "Prudence, forgive me." The room fell silent. 2 undergraduate assistants exchanged nervous glances, while Jacob's eyes widened with barely contained excitement. "This could be connected to the Wexford disappearance," he breathed, already mentally drafting his thesis. Prudence Wexford, who vanished in 1878. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. She'd spent months securing funding for this preservation project, promising Hawthorne University a straightforward architectural study. This discovery threatened to change everything. "We need to contact Lillian," one of the undergraduates suggested, already reaching for her device. As if summoned by her name, Lillian Grant appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes immediately focusing on the fallen frame. The museum director's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," he said, already calculating publicity angles, "it seems our little restoration project just got significantly more interesting." Eleanor remained silent, her hand resting protectively on the frame. The weight of history pressed in around her, along with the unsettling feeling that some secrets were never meant to be disturbed. The morning air carried a crisp October chill as Eleanor Blackridge and Jacob Moreno made their way up the narrow flagstone path to Mrs. Agnes Hill's cottage. The modest Cape Cod home stood in stark contrast to the imposing Wexford estate they'd left behind. Its weathered blue shutters and smoke curling from the chimney, offering a sense of warmth the estate had. Despite her fragile appearance, her blue eyes sparkled with intelligence as she ushered them inside. "I've been expecting you two since I heard about that portrait," she said, leading them into a living room that seemed frozen in time. Crocheted doilies covered armrests, and every surface held either a teacup or a photograph. The walls were lined with bookshelves, sagging under the weight of local history. Jacob's eyes widened at the collection of sepia-toned images of Wexford Estate in its prime. "These are incredible," he murmured, leaning closer to examine one. "Sit, sit," the elderly woman instructed, lowering herself carefully into a worn armchair. "I've prepared chamomile. Good for settling nerves, and we'll need settled nerves for this conversation." Eleanor accepted her cup gratefully, noting how the historian's hands trembled slightly as she poured. "Mrs. Hill, we found an inscription on the back of the portrait. It mentioned someone named Prudence." The old woman's expression darkened. "Prudence Wexford. The name hasn't been spoken aloud in this town for generations." She sipped her tea, gathering her thoughts. "My grandmother told me stories when I was just a girl. Prudence vanished in 1878. One day she was there, the next, gone. The family claimed she'd been sent to Europe for education, but nobody ever heard from her again." Jacob leaned forward, recorder in hand. "And the East Wing?" "Cursed," they said. Mrs. Hill's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "No servant would enter it after dark. They heard things, crying, scratching. Thomas Wexford sealed it completely by 1880. Nobody questioned why." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "Do you believe she died there?" The historian's gaze drifted to a distant photograph of the estate. "Some truths in Ashford were never meant for daylight, Professor Blackridge. The Wexfords were powerful, and powerful families bury their secrets deep." She reached for Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. "But perhaps it's time. That poor girl has waited long enough." Eleanor nodded, activating her device to record every precious detail. The professor knew Mrs. Hill's memory was one of the last living links to Prudence's time, a fragile thread connecting present to past, growing thinner with each passing day. The attic of Wexford Estate groaned under Maya Chu's careful footsteps. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of afternoon light, slicing through the grimy windows. She had volunteered to catalog the upper levels while Eleanor and Jacob interviewed the town historian. "Just boxes of old tax records," Maya muttered, sneezing as she shifted another crate. Her flashlight beam caught something unusual, a stack of brittle newspapers from the 1870s, arranged too neatly to be accidental. Beneath them, partially concealed by floorboards, sat a metal box, its surface etched with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. "Eleanor!" she called down the narrow staircase. "You need to see this." The lot gave way after careful application of penetrating oil. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well, lay a leather-bound journal. The name Charles Gray was embossed on its cover in faded gold lettering. "The original architect," Eleanor whispered, her fingers hovering reverently above the pages. "This could change everything we know about the estate." The three researchers gathered around a sturdy oak table in what once served as the estate's library. Jacob positioned their battery-powered lamp to cast even light across the fragile pages as Maya carefully photographed each one before they dared to turn it. Gray's handwriting was meticulous. Architectural notations, material lists, and daily progress reports filled the early sections. But halfway through, the entries took a disturbing turn. "October 12, 1877, Eleanor read aloud. "Thomas Wexford has requested a modification to the East Wing plans. A chamber is to be constructed between the existing walls, accessible only via a concealed mechanism. He insists this addition remain unrecorded in the official blueprints." Maya, who had maintained professional skepticism throughout their project, visibly paled as she examined the detailed diagrams. "This isn't just a hidden storage room," she said, pointing to the measurements. "These are living quarters, a prison cell disguised as architecture." The journal documented the construction of false walls, a trapdoor system, and a complex lever mechanism hidden behind what appeared to be ordinary decorative elements. "Look at the date," Jacob said, his voice tight. "This was built 9 months before Prudence disappeared." Eleanor sat back, her academic detachment crumbling. This wasn't a crime of passion or a tragic accident. This was premeditated. Someone designed her disappearance, literally built it into the house. Maya turned to the final pages, where Gray had sketched the completed chamber in cross-section. No windows, one entrance, hidden from view. Her typically steady hands trembled slightly. I've restored dozens of historic buildings, but I've never seen anything like this. We need to find this room, Eleanor said, her voice hardening with resolve. If Prudence was imprisoned here, we owe it to her to uncover the truth. The Ashford County Archives occupied the basement of a weathered Victorian building, its air heavy with the scent of aging paper and forgotten lives. Jacob Moreno spent 3 consecutive days hunched over metal tables, his fingers carefully turning brittle pages that threatened to crumble at the slightest touch. "I think I found something," he called to Eleanor Blackridge, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "Court depositions from 1879, just months after Prudence vanished." Eleanor abandoned her own research and joined her student. The box before them contained testimonies from former Wexford estate servants, each account more disturbing than the last. The professor adjusted her reading glasses, her heart racing as she scanned the faded handwriting. "They all mention the same pattern," Jacob whispered. "Prudence was suddenly confined to her quarters without explanation. Several servants reported hearing crying at night, desperate sobbing that echoed through the east wing. The documents revealed a household gripped by fear. A gardener named William testified that Thomas Wexford had doubled the locks on the east wing doors. A cook described how the family stopped mentioning Prudence's name entirely, as if she had never existed. "Look at this," Eleanor said, her finger trembling as it traced a particularly damning account. Thomas Wexford dismissed 3 servants in a single week. All had asked questions about the young mistress's whereabouts. But it was the testimony of Nora Jenkins, a 16-year-old maid, that sent chills down their spines. Her deposition described seeing Catherine Blackwell, Prudence's aunt, carrying a food tray toward the forbidden wing late at night. "Her face was pale as death," Nora had written, "and her eyes were rimmed red, like she'd been weeping for hours. When she saw me watching, she turned away quickly, but not before I glimpsed what looked like guilt in her expression." Eleanor pushed away from the table, suddenly needing air. The weight of history pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "The house was ruled by silence," she murmured, more to herself than to Jacob. "A conspiracy of shame." Jacob carefully photographed each document with his smartphone, methodically creating a digital archive. "What strikes me," he said, "is how many people suspected something terrible had happened, yet no one intervened." "Fear is a powerful silencer," Eleanor replied, thinking of her own past failure to speak up when it mattered. And the Wexfords wielded enormous influence in Ashford. As they packed away the fragile papers, the young researcher paused. "Do you think we'll ever know exactly what happened to her?" Eleanor stared at the box of testimonies. Voices from the past, finally being heard, after nearly 150 years of silence. "We have to," she said firmly. "For Prudence." The package arrived without warning at Hawthorne University's special collections. Wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine that looked nearly as old as its contents. Marjorie Winters, the head archivist, called Eleanor Blackridge immediately. "It was delivered by courier this morning," Marjorie explained as Eleanor and Jacob examined the faded lavender diary on the reading room table. "The sender wished to remain anonymous, but included a note saying it belonged in your Wexford research." Eleanor slipped on cotton gloves before carefully opening the brittle cover. The first page bore elegant script, "Property of Anne Wexford, 1877. A faint scent of lavender still clung to the pages. Ghostly and persistent after nearly 150 years. "This is extraordinary," Jacob whispered, leaning closer. "How did someone know about our research?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her attention was fixed on Anne's handwriting, which began neat and controlled, but grew increasingly erratic in later entries. The mother's words painted a household descending into darkness. Thomas grows colder by the day, one entry read. Prudence tries so desperately to please him, yet he turns away as if the sight of her brings him pain. What have I done by bringing such a gentle soul into this merciless house? Maya arrived an hour later, bringing specialized equipment to document each fragile page. The three researchers worked in reverent silence, piecing together Anne's growing terror through scattered entries. There is unspeakable fear in this house now, Anne had written in April 1878. I see the shadow growing over Prudence each day. Catherine watches her with such strange intensity. I begged Thomas to send our daughter away to school, anywhere but here, but he refuses to discuss the matter. The final entry, dated just 3 days before Prudence's disappearance, made Eleanor's hands tremble. I have failed her, my beautiful daughter, my only child. I cannot stand against them, and I cannot flee with her as I had planned. The doctor increases my laudanum daily, and I can scarcely keep my thoughts clear enough to write these words. Prudence, if somehow you find this, forgive me for my weakness. Some secrets I will carry to my grave, God help me. Eleanor closed the diary gently, fighting back tears. The mother's anguish resonated too deeply. She remembered Sarah Winters, her promising student from 5 years ago, who had come to her office with bruises she tried to explain away. Eleanor had hesitated, unsure of how to intervene, and by the time she contacted authorities, Sarah had withdrawn from the university. Eleanor? Maya's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you all right? 2 mothers, Eleanor said softly, separated by centuries, both unable to protect their daughters. She straightened her shoulders. We won't let Prudence be forgotten again. Eleanor Blackridge held Charles Gray's weathered journal with trembling hands, its pages spread across the makeshift workstation they'd established in Wexford Estate's main hall. The architectural diagrams were meticulous, almost obsessive in their precision. There, she pointed, her finger tracing the faded ink. Behind the east wing bookcase, Gray designed a hidden mechanism, a lever disguised as an ornamental finial. Jacob Moreno nodded eagerly, already moving toward the crumbling shelves that lined the wall. Maya Chu followed, her conservation kit slung over her shoulder, camera ready to document whatever they might find. Be careful, Eleanor cautioned, as Jacob ran his hands along the dusty woodwork. These structures haven't been touched in nearly 150 years. The graduate student moved methodically, checking each carved finial until his fingers closed around one that gave slightly under pressure. Professor, I think His words cut off as the finial rotated with a dull click. The entire bookshelf shuddered, then swung inward on groaning hinges. A rush of cold air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying the musty scent of long-sealed spaces. The 3 stood frozen, flashlights illuminating a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into blackness. My God, Maya whispered, her usual skepticism momentarily abandoned. It's exactly where Gray's blueprints indicated. Eleanor stepped forward first, her academic curiosity overcoming the chill of apprehension. I'll lead. Jacob, stay close. Maya, document everything. Their flashlights cast dancing shadows as they descended the tight spiral staircase. The temperature dropped with each step, the walls pressing in around them. Eleanor counted 17 steps before they reached a small landing and a low doorway. The chamber beyond was barely 10 feet square, windowless and stark. A single cot with a rotted mattress stood against one wall. A small table, its surface thick with dust, held what appeared to be a tarnished water pitcher. This is where they kept her, Eleanor said softly. This is where Prudence was imprisoned. Maya's hands shook visibly as she photographed the room, her camera clicking in the heavy silence. Jacob stood in the doorway, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by somber understanding. Look, Eleanor pointed to the cot. Among the decayed fabric lay a blue velvet ribbon. its color somehow preserved despite the decades. Beside it, a small silver locket gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. Maya carefully lifted the locket with gloved hands, opening it to reveal a miniature portrait of a woman with sorrowful eyes. Anne Wexford, Eleanor confirmed, recognizing the face from their research. Her mother. The chamber seemed to press in on them, heavy with accumulated sorrow and desperation. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, visibly affected. "She was just a girl," he said quietly. "And they locked her away down here." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "And now we're going to make sure she's remembered." Snow fell in thick, silent flakes across Ashford as Eleanor Blackridge and her team trudged through the cemetery grounds. The Wexford family crypt loomed before them, a stone sentinel half buried in winter's embrace. After weeks of bureaucratic wrangling, the Historical Preservation Society had finally granted them access to the sealed mausoleum. "I never thought paperwork could be more chilling than an actual crypt," Maya Chu muttered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she adjusted her conservation equipment. The conservation expert had insisted on proper documentation protocols despite the cold. Jacob Moreno pried open the rusted iron gate, wincing at its mournful creak. "Professor, are you sure about this?" he asked, glancing at Eleanor's pale face. She nodded, pulling her scarf tighter. "Prudence deserves to have her story told, all of it." Inside, their flashlights cut through decades of dust and cobwebs. Ornate stone sarcophagi bore the names of Wexford patriarchs and matriarchs, their grandeur untouched by time. Thomas and Anne Wexford lay side by side in death, though Eleanor wondered if they had found peace. Maya moved methodically along the walls, examining every crevice. "There's something off about this stonework," she said, pointing to a section where the mortar appeared newer than the surrounding areas. Working together, they managed to dislodge a loose stone, revealing a small cavity behind it. Jacob's camera flashed repeatedly as Maya carefully extracted a small, unmarked wooden box, no larger than a child's shoebox. "It's a coffin," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "An unmarked coffin." With gloved hands, Maya gently lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated linen that crumbled at the edges, lay a single blue velvet ribbon. The fabric had somehow retained its rich color despite the passage of time. "It's identical," Jacob said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Identical to the one we found in the hidden chamber." Eleanor reached out instinctively before stopping herself. She didn't need to touch it to know. They buried something of hers, but not her memory, not her name. Her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. She died in that room, alone and forgotten. Jacob lowered his camera, his ambitious drive visibly giving way to something more profound. "This isn't just about academic discovery anymore, is it?" he asked, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "It never was," she replied. "This is about justice." Maya carefully photographed and cataloged the ribbon before securing it in a preservation container. The textile pattern and dye composition matched the chamber ribbon exactly, she confirmed. This was deliberately placed here, separate from any official burial. As they emerged from the crypt into the snowy afternoon, Eleanor felt the weight of Prudence's tragedy pressing down upon her shoulders. The young woman had been erased twice, once in life, imprisoned in that hidden chamber, and again in death, denied even the dignity of a proper grave. "We're her voice now," Eleanor said, watching snowflakes settle on the ancient stone. "All of us." Eleanor Blackridge sat across from Mrs. Agnes Hill in the elderly woman's cottage, watching as the town historian's frail hands cupped her teacup. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows of the Cape Cod home. "There was always talk about Catherine Blackwell," Mrs. Hill said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother spoke of her episodes after Prudence vanished. They called it madness back then, but I suspect it was guilt eating away at her soul." Eleanor leaned forward. "Did she keep any records? Letters, perhaps?" Journals, Mrs. Hill nodded slowly. Catherine wrote compulsively. The family tried to burn them after her death, but rumors say some were saved by a sympathetic servant. The next morning, Eleanor gathered Jacob Moreno and Maya Chu at the Ashford Historical Society. The building, a converted Victorian home, housed the town's collective memory in dusty boxes and aging cabinets. "We need to check every donation from the 1880s, Eleanor instructed, her voice tight with anticipation. Look for anything connected to the Blackwell family. Hours passed as they combed through brittle newspapers and faded correspondence. Jacob's enthusiasm waned as the afternoon stretched on, but Maya remained methodical, checking each item twice. "Professor!" Jacob's voice echoed through the silent building. "I found something." In the basement storage area, beneath a stack of agricultural records, sat a small leather trunk. The brass lock had long since corroded, and the initials CB were barely visible on its weathered surface. Maya carefully lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, lay 3 leather-bound volumes. "Catherine Blackwell's Journals," Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling as she accepted the first book from Maya. Back at Hawthorne University, the 3 researchers gathered in Eleanor's office. The conservation expert handled the fragile pages with gloved hands as they began to read Catherine's private thoughts. The entries started innocuously: household accounts, social observations, but grew increasingly disturbed after Prudence's 16th birthday. Catherine described the girl as willful and dangerous to herself and our name. "Listen to this," Eleanor read aloud. "April 9th, 1878. Thomas asked what must be done. I told him what he already knew. The east wing can be sealed. No one need ever know." Jacob paced the small office. She helped imprison her own niece. The final volume contained Catherine's confessions. Her handwriting grew erratic, the ink blotched with what appeared to be teardrops. She described bringing meals to Prudence, the girl's pleas for freedom, and her own growing doubts. The last entry, dated December 23, 1879, contained just one paragraph. "She is gone now. They say it was fever, but I know it was despair. I told Thomas it was necessary to protect the family name. Prudence, forgive me. I was weak, and I was afraid." Eleanor closed the journal, meeting Maya's tear-filled eyes. "We found our answer," she said quietly. "Now we need to make sure Prudence is remembered." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the main study as Jacob Moreno ran his fingers along the ornate carvings of Thomas Wexford's mahogany desk. The restoration team had been meticulously cleaning the room for weeks, but something about the repeated pattern of roses and thorns caught his eye. "Eleanor, there's something odd about these carvings," he called out, pressing against what appeared to be a decorative knot in the wood. With a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open beneath the desktop. Professor Eleanor Blackridge hurried across the room, her eyes widening at the discovery. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded black ribbon, the paper brittle with age. She carefully lifted them, recognizing Thomas Wexford's distinctive handwriting immediately. "These are his private papers," she whispered, gently unfolding the first letter. As she read, her expression darkened. "My God, Jacob, these are confessions." The letters revealed a tormented father, writing to no one but himself, lamenting his failures. "I cannot bear to see her face." One passage read, "For in it I see only my weakness, my shame. What will become of our name if the truth is known?" While Eleanor continued reading, Jacob examined Thomas's walking cane propped in the corner. The silver handle twisted unexpectedly in his grasp, revealing another hidden compartment within the shaft. Inside was a single document, folded and sealed with wax. "It's from his solicitor," Jacob said, carefully breaking the seal. "Dated 3 months before Prudence disappeared." The document detailed Thomas's desperate attempts to arrange a quiet adoption for his daughter, offering substantial payment to a family willing to take her far away. The solicitor reported that no suitable arrangement could be made without raising unwanted questions. "He tried to erase her," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with anger. "Not just after she vanished, but before. He wanted her gone." Maya Chu entered the study carrying her conservation kit. Seeing their expressions, she set it down. "What have you found?" Eleanor passed her the letters. Evidence that Prudence was betrayed by everyone meant to protect her. Her father saw her as nothing but a source of shame. But what was this shame? Jacob asked, scanning through the papers. He never explicitly states what Prudence did to warrant such treatment. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. That's because she likely did nothing. The shame was his, not hers. She stared at Thomas Wexford's portrait, hanging above the fireplace, his stern eyes gazing down at them. He was willing to pay strangers to take his daughter away, rather than face whatever truth she represented. Maya carefully placed the documents in acid-free folders. "We need to tell Lillian about this. These letters change our understanding of the whole case." "They don't just change the case," Eleanor said, turning away from the portrait. "They change history. Prudence wasn't just forgotten. She was deliberately erased." After 4 months of meticulous conservation work, the portrait restoration day had finally arrived. Maya Chu stood in the climate-controlled laboratory at Hawthorne University, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The massive frame lay on a specially constructed table, surrounded by specialized tools and equipment. "Ready?" she asked, glancing at Eleanor Blackridge and Jacob Moreno, who stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Eleanor nodded silently, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. The conservation expert carefully inserted a small key into the ornate lock that had secured the portrait for nearly a century and a half. The mechanism yielded with a soft click that seemed to echo through the hushed room. "Moment of truth," Jacob whispered, his smartphone ready to document every second of the unveiling. With practiced precision, Maya began the painstaking process of removing the protective coverings. Layer by layer, she peeled away the shroud of time, dust, discolored varnish, and grime, each carefully extracted to reveal what lay beneath. The team watched in reverent silence as a face emerged from the darkness of history. Prudence Wexford gazed back at them, her expression captured in soft, melancholy tones. She appeared to be about 19, with delicate features framed by dark hair. The artist had painted her in a blue dress, seated beside a window that showed only darkness beyond. Her eyes held a quiet dignity despite their sadness, a silent accusation that transcended time. "My God," Eleanor breathed, stepping closer. "She's beautiful." Maya nodded, her usual skepticism momentarily abandoned. "The technique is remarkable. Look at the detail in the eyes. Whoever painted this knew her well." Jacob carefully photographed every inch of the canvas before Maya gently turned the portrait over. "Wait," he said suddenly, pointing to a faded signature in the bottom corner of the frame's reverse side. "That doesn't match any known artist of the period." Eleanor leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "It's disguised, but—" Her voice faltered. "That's Thomas Wexford's handwriting. I recognize it from his letters." "Her father painted her?" Maya asked, her professional detachment finally cracking. "After what he did?" The revelation hung heavy in the air. Thomas Wexford, the man who had allowed his daughter to be imprisoned and forgotten, had immortalized her face with his own hand. Perhaps in guilt, perhaps in grief. Eleanor stood transfixed before the portrait, meeting Prudence's painted gaze. The professor's hand trembled slightly as she reached toward the canvas, stopping just short of touching it. "I promise you," she whispered, "this silence ends now." Jacob placed a supportive hand on Eleanor's shoulder as Maya carefully secured the portrait for its upcoming exhibition. The young woman's face, hidden for nearly 150 years, would finally be seen, and her story would finally be told. The first private viewing of Wexford Estate drew a select crowd of academics, preservationists, and local dignitaries. Eleanor Blackridge stood beside the newly restored portrait, explaining the painstaking conservation process to a small gathering. The painting of Prudence, with its haunting eyes and delicate brushwork, commanded the room's attention. "We believe this portrait was hidden deliberately," Eleanor explained, her voice steady despite the weight of the story. The inscription on the back suggests profound regret. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Jacob noticed something peculiar on the grand staircase. A blue velvet ribbon, identical to those found in the secret chamber and family crypt, had been tied around the carved newel post. The graduate student called for Eleanor and Maya immediately. "Nobody saw who left this?" Maya asked, her usually skeptical demeanor giving way to visible unease. She photographed the ribbon in place before Eleanor carefully untied it. "I'll check the security footage," Lillian Grant announced, her professional composure slightly fractured. The museum director had initially viewed the Wexford project as a publicity opportunity, but the mounting evidence of tragedy had affected her more than she cared to admit. In the small security office, the four colleagues huddled around a monitor. The footage showed guests mingling, then departing one by one. Near the end, a strange distortion appeared on screen, a shadow moving near the staircase, but no discernible person. "Equipment malfunction," Maya suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or someone who knows how to avoid cameras," Jacob countered. Lillian ran her fingers through her hair, a rare display of vulnerability. "What if someone in Ashford still remembers, or still cares?" she whispered. "Its ribbon wasn't in our exhibition. Someone brought it here." Eleanor carefully placed the ribbon in an evidence bag. The soft velvet, faded but unmistakable, matched the specimens they discovered in their investigation. "Whoever left this knows details we haven't made public yet," she said. The professor slipped the bagged ribbon into her pocket, her mind racing. Was it a descendant of the Wexford or Blackwell families? A local historian with access to private records? Or something less explicable? As they locked up the estate, Eleanor lingered in the entrance hall. The portrait of Prudence seemed to watch her from the adjacent room, those painted eyes following her movements. A cold draft whispered through the corridor, though all windows were sealed. "We're not finished here, are we?" Jacob asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I think the past isn't done with us yet." The ribbon in her pocket felt impossibly heavy, a tangible link between their world and Prudence's, a bridge across nearly 150 years of silence. Eleanor Blackridge's hands trembled as she spread the yellowed blueprints across the makeshift table in Wexford Estate's library. The team had been reviewing the original architectural plans for the fifth time when Jacob Moreno noticed a discrepancy in the West Wing measurements. "There's space unaccounted for," the graduate student said, tracing his finger along the faded lines. "Behind this wall, it's at least 8 feet deep." Maya Chu leaned forward, her conservation expert's eye catching details others might miss. "Look at these pencil marks." Someone tried to erase this section. The three exchanged glances, the weight of discovery hanging between them. They had already found one hidden chamber that held Prudence's secrets. Could there be another? By afternoon, they had assembled their tools. Lillian Grant had reluctantly approved the exploration after Eleanor convinced her of its historical significance. "Just don't damage anything that could affect our funding," the museum director had warned. The west wall stood before them, its Victorian wallpaper peeling like dead skin. Jacob tapped different sections, listening for hollow spaces. "Here," he finally announced, marking a spot with chalk. They worked methodically, cutting through the ancient plaster with surgical precision. Maya documented every step with her device, while Eleanor directed their efforts. When the wall finally yielded, a cloud of dust, nearly 2 centuries old, billowed outward. "Flashlights," Eleanor whispered, though she couldn't have explained why she lowered her voice. The beam cut through darkness, revealing a space smaller than the first chamber, barely 6 feet square. Unlike the previous room, this one was nearly empty. No furniture, no letters, just two items placed with deliberate care in the center. A child's cotton dress, once white but now yellowed with age, and beside it, a small leather-bound sketchbook. Maya, wearing conservation gloves, carefully opened the book. "Oh my God," she breathed. Page after page showed the same image, a girl, drawn in a child's unsteady hand, standing before a door. Sometimes she was reaching for the handle, sometimes pounding with tiny fists, sometimes simply sitting, head bowed before the impassable barrier. "These are Prudence's drawings," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "She must have been so young when they first—" Jacob, usually eager to analyze and theorize, stood silent, visibly shaken. Why would they keep these? Why not destroy them? "Guilt," Eleanor answered, thinking of Catherine Blackwell's tormented confession. Someone couldn't bear to erase her completely. The professor stared at the small dress, imagining the child who once wore it, drawing pictures of the freedom she craved. Eleanor felt Prudence's presence more strongly here than in any other part of the estate, not as a ghost, but as a memory demanding justice. "We need to document everything," she finally said. "Every page, every thread. This isn't just evidence anymore. This is her testimony." Eleanor Blackridge's office phone rang early Monday morning. She recognized the university president's number and braced herself. "Eleanor, we need to talk about this Wexford situation," President Harmon said, his voice tight. "Edith McClellan is threatening to withdraw her $2 million pledge to the new humanities building." Eleanor gripped the receiver tighter. Edith McClellan was Hawthorne University's most generous donor, a woman whose family fortune traced back to railroad money and, as they'd recently discovered, distant marriage ties to the Wexfords themselves. "She says exposing this family tragedy is sensationalism, not scholarship," the president continued. "She's demanding we shut down the project immediately." Eleanor stared at the photograph of Prudence on her desk. "And what do you think we should do?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Be reasonable. This is 20 faculty positions we're talking about." The conversation ended with thinly veiled threats about tenure review. Eleanor had barely hung up when Jacob Moreno knocked on her door, his face ashen. "You need to see this," Jacob said, sliding a legal document across her desk. "It was delivered to the department this morning. The injunction came from a Blackwell family descendant, a corporate attorney from Boston, who claimed the exhibition would cause irreparable harm to living relatives and defame historical figures unable to defend themselves." Maya arrived minutes later, having received her own copy. "They're trying to silence her again," she said, pacing the small office. 140 years later, and they're still locking her away. That night, Eleanor woke gasping, her chest tight and heart racing. The familiar grip of panic squeezed her lungs. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Jacob. "I'm sorry," she whispered when he answered. "I shouldn't have called." "It's okay," he said. "Maya's here too. We were working on response strategies." Eleanor's hands trembled as she took her medication. The last panic attack this severe had been years ago, after she'd failed to recognize a student's cry for help, a mistake that had ended in tragedy. The next morning, Lillian Grant summoned the team to her office. "The university's legal department is advising us to compromise," she explained. "They suggest we remove Catherine's confession and any mention of imprisonment." Eleanor shook her head. "That would erase everything that happened to her." "Your career is at stake," Lillian reminded her. "All of your careers." That afternoon, Eleanor stood alone in the secret chamber, touching the blue ribbon they'd found. The weight of Prudence's silenced voice pressed against her conscience. When she emerged, Jacob and Maya were waiting. "Whatever you decide," Maya said quietly, "we're with you." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Then we fight. Prudence deserves her truth." Maya Chu knelt in the dust of a secret chamber, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. 2 weeks had passed since they'd first discovered this hidden prison, but something kept drawing her back. The conservation expert ran her gloved fingers along the crumbling mortar between stones, searching for anything they might have missed. Prudence deserved more than to be remembered as just a victim, she whispered to herself. The team had uncovered so many voices: Thomas's guilt-ridden letters, Catherine's tormented confessions, Anne's grief, but Prudence herself remained silent, defined only by others' words. As Maya pressed against a loose stone near the floor, it gave way with surprising ease. Her heart quickened as her fingers found something wedged in the cavity behind. A small leather-bound book, its pages warped with age and damp. She carefully extracted it, immediately recognizing what she held. Prudence Wexford's own diary. "Eleanor," she called, her voice echoing through the estate's hollow corridors. "Jacob, come quickly." Within minutes, Eleanor Blackridge and Jacob Moreno were huddled beside her in the cramped chamber, their breath visible in the cold air. Eleanor's hands trembled as Maya passed her the fragile journal. "My God," the professor whispered, carefully opening the brittle cover. "Her handwriting is so alive." The diary entries began innocuously: observations about the changing seasons, complaints about restrictive dresses, and longing descriptions of a young man from the village. But as they progressed, the tone darkened. Prudence wrote of overheard arguments between her parents, of Catherine's increasing control over household matters, of doors mysteriously locked. The most revealing entry described a plan to escape the estate with the help of a kitchen servant named Martha, who had promised to leave a door unlocked during the next full moon. "I shall take nothing but Mother's locket and my blue ribbon," Prudence had written. "By this time tomorrow, I shall be free of these walls and—" The sentence ended abruptly, the remaining pages torn away. The final entry was dated the very day Prudence vanished. Eleanor wiped tears from her cheeks as she read the words aloud. Jacob sat in stunned silence, while Maya documented the diary with her device, her usual professional detachment crumbling. "She was so close," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Someone must have discovered her plan." "Catherine," Jacob suggested, "or Thomas himself." Maya carefully placed the diary in an archival container. "This changes everything. These aren't just her possessions anymore. These are her words, her voice." Eleanor nodded, determination replacing her grief. "And after 140 years of silence, this voice will finally be heard." The probate court's marble halls echoed with gasps as Catherine Blackwell's letters were unsealed after nearly 150 years. Eleanor Blackridge watched as the court clerk carefully removed the brittle pages from their envelope, revealing secrets that had been deliberately buried for generations. These letters confirm Catherine knew exactly what happened to Prudence. Eleanor whispered to Maya Chu, who sat beside her, documenting every moment with her smartphone. She didn't just participate in the imprisonment, she orchestrated it. The Blackwell family's carefully constructed legacy crumbled within hours. 3 distant relatives who had proudly claimed their connection to the prestigious bloodline now faced a horrifying revelation. Their ancestor had been complicit in what amounted to imprisonment and possible murder. By afternoon, the first lawsuit landed on Eleanor's desk, a cease and desist order demanding all mention of Catherine be removed from the exhibition. "They're threatening to sue the university, the museum, and us personally," Lillian Grant announced, pacing Eleanor's office. The museum director's voice trembled with barely contained panic. "Edith McClellan has already called twice. She's considering withdrawing her endowment." Eleanor stood firm. "The truth matters more than money or reputation. Catherine's own words condemn her, not our research." Jacob Moreno found himself caught in the crossfire when a publishing agent approached him at his apartment that evening. The offer was substantial, a 6-figure advance for an inside scoop on the Wexford scandal, with emphasis on the haunting and salacious details. "Think about your career," the agent urged. "This could set you up for life." The graduate student stared at the contract, remembering the blue ribbon found in Prudence's prison. the desperation in her diary entries. He thought of Eleanor's unwavering commitment to dignity over sensationalism. The next morning, Jacob arrived at Eleanor's office with dark circles under his eyes, but resolution in his voice. "I turned them down. I want to co-author the official report with you and Maya. Something scholarly, respectful." Maya looked up from her laptop, surprised but clearly pleased. "That's going to pay a lot less." "Some things matter more than money," Jacob replied. As legal threats multiplied and university administrators grew increasingly nervous, the three scholars worked through nights and weekends, sacrificing sleep and personal lives to document everything with meticulous care. Their shared purpose forged a bond deeper than mere professional collaboration. "We're the only voice Prudence has," Eleanor reminded them during a particularly exhausting night of revisions. And Catherine's letters prove she knew it was wrong, even as she did it. The Blackwell legacy was unraveling, but something stronger was being woven in its place, a commitment to truth that would outlast all attempts to silence it. The security guard's voice trembled as he called Eleanor Blackridge at 3 a.m. "Professor, you need to see this footage. Now." Within the hour, Eleanor stood in the newly restored East Wing, staring at the security monitor with Jacob Moreno and Maya Chu huddled beside her. "Play it again," Eleanor whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. The night vision footage showed the empty corridor leading to Prudence's portrait. At exactly 2:17, a shimmer appeared, like heat rising from pavement. Then, unmistakably, a translucent figure materialized. A woman in a high-necked dress with fitted sleeves and a bustled skirt stood gazing at the portrait. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style of the late 19th century. When she turned toward the camera, everyone gasped. The apparition's features matched Prudence's likeness exactly. "This can't be real," Maya murmured, her scientific skepticism visibly shaken. She'd spent months restoring that portrait, knew every brushstroke of Prudence's face. Someone must have tampered with the footage. Jacob ran the video through 3 different authentication programs. "It's clean, no editing signatures." His voice was hushed with awe. What if she's trying to tell us something more?" By noon, the footage had leaked. Lillian Grant was simultaneously horrified and thrilled, already fielding calls from paranormal investigation shows. "This could triple our visitor numbers," she told Eleanor, who merely nodded, distracted by a deeper realization. Within days, Ashford became divided. Tour buses arrived packed with ghost hunters and thrill seekers. The estate's parking lot overflowed with vehicles bearing license plates from neighboring states. Local churches held prayer vigils, demanding the disturbance of the dead cease immediately. A petition to close the estate gathered hundreds of signatures. Eleanor watched it all with surprising calm. At a heated town meeting, she stood before the crowd, her voice steady. For 140 years, Prudence Wexford was silenced. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, her story deserves to be told. Walking back to her car afterward, Eleanor noticed Mrs. Hill waiting for her, frail but determined. The elderly historian smiled knowingly. "You don't seem frightened by our visitor." "I'm not," Eleanor admitted. "For the first time, I understand that some truths need more than just academic validation." She thought of the ghost's face, not angry or vengeful, but watchful, waiting. If Prudence has returned, it's because we're finally listening. That night, Eleanor returned to the East Wing alone. She placed fresh flowers beneath the portrait and whispered, "We won't silence you again." As she turned to leave, the temperature dropped suddenly. And for just a moment, Eleanor felt a presence beside her, not malevolent, but grateful. The supernatural, once the domain of fiction in her rational mind, had become an unexpected ally in the pursuit of truth. Eleanor Blackridge hunched over her laptop, surrounded by stacks of yellow genealogy charts in the university's special collections room. For 3 days, she had been meticulously tracing bloodlines to counter the legal claims against the exhibition. Her eyes burned from strain as she cross-referenced census records with birth certificates. "I think I found something," Jacob said, sliding a document across the table. The Blackwell family tree from 1860. Eleanor nodded absently, her focus locked on the screen. Then she froze. The name on her monitor seemed to pulse. Catherine Blackwell. She traced the line with her finger, following marriages and births down through generations until she reached a familiar name, her own grandmother. "This can't be right," she whispered, but the evidence was undeniable. Eleanor was a direct descendant of Catherine Blackwell, Prudence's aunt, the very woman who had imprisoned the girl. Maya looked up from her conservation notes. "What's wrong? It's me. I'm connected to this." Eleanor's voice trembled as she turned the laptop around. "Catherine Blackwell was my great-great-great-grandmother." The conservation expert leaned forward, her skepticism momentarily forgotten. "Are you certain?" "The dates, the locations, everything matches my family records." Eleanor pressed her palms against her eyes. "All this time, I've been pursuing justice for Prudence, and I'm related to her jailer." Jacob squeezed her shoulder. "This doesn't change anything about the work we're doing." But it changed everything for Eleanor. The following week, she received a letter from the estate's attorneys. As Catherine's descendant, she had inherited a 15% share of Wexford estate. The irony was crushing. The professor now owned part of the prison that had inspired her research. That evening, Eleanor stood alone in the secret chamber, holding the blue velvet ribbon they had discovered months earlier. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just academic research anymore. It was personal atonement. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. "I can't undo what she did to you." When Lillian called to discuss converting the East Wing into a tourist attraction, Eleanor firmly refused. "This is a memorial site now," she insisted. "I won't have Prudence exploited again." For the first time since finding the portrait, Eleanor felt something beyond academic curiosity or professional obligation. A sense of purpose, perhaps even redemption, stirred within her. She would use her unexpected inheritance to ensure Prudence's story was told with dignity. As she locked the chamber door behind her, Eleanor felt Catherine's ghost receding and her own resolve strengthening. Some burdens were meant to be carried, not escaped. "This isn't a carnival sideshow," Eleanor Blackridge declared, slamming her palm against the conference table. "Prudence Wexford deserves dignity, not ghost tours and Halloween promotions." The university administration remained unmoved. Dean Wilson adjusted his glasses and sighed. "The haunted attraction angle would triple our projected revenue. People want thrills, Professor Blackridge, not academic lectures." Eleanor exchanged frustrated glances with Jacob and Maya. For months, they had fought this battle against Hawthorne University's marketing plans. The East Wing's restoration was complete, but its purpose had become a bitter point of contention. "We found a young woman who was imprisoned and erased from history," Maya argued, her voice steady despite her anger. "And your response is to sell tickets to people hoping to see her ghost?" Jacob leaned forward. "What if we compromise? A dignified memorial that acknowledges both the historical significance and the supernatural elements that people are drawn to." The proposal they eventually crafted satisfied no one completely, but created enough common ground to move forward. Eleanor insisted on scholarly integrity, while the university got enough of the haunted Wexford narrative to drive ticket sales. On opening night, a small but vocal group of protesters gathered at the estate's wrought iron gates. Their signs read, "Let the dead rest," and "Stop exploiting tragedy." Local news crews filmed as Eleanor approached the crowd, inviting their spokesperson to tour the exhibition before judging it. Inside, the atmosphere was solemn. Soft lantern light illuminated the restored chambers, with Prudence's portrait as the centerpiece. Glass cases displayed her diary, the blue ribbons, and other artifacts, each with detailed context rather than sensationalized descriptions. The secret chamber had been preserved but treated with reverence, a memorial space rather than a macabre attraction. Mrs. Hill arrived in a wheelchair, her frail body belying the fierce determination in her eyes. Eleanor helped her to the ribbon stretched across the entrance to the main gallery. For nearly 150 years, the elderly historian said, her voice surprisingly strong, this town kept Prudence's story buried. Tonight, we finally give her back her voice. With trembling hands, Mrs. Hill cut the ribbon. Applause rippled through the crowd of academics, journalists, and curious locals. Even some of the protesters, who had accepted Eleanor's invitation, stood in respectful silence. Later that evening, Eleanor found Jacob and Maya in the portrait gallery, staring at Prudence's face. "We did right by her," Maya said softly. Eleanor nodded, watching as visitors moved through the space, reading, reflecting, and remembering a young woman who had been forgotten for too long. The controversy would continue, but tonight, at least, Prudence Wexford had finally come home. The autumn rain pattered against the hospice windows as Eleanor Blackridge entered room 217, carrying a thermos of chamomile tea and a portable recorder. Mrs. Agnes Hill lay propped against white pillows, her once robust frame now diminished, but her eyes still sparkled with the same fierce intelligence that had guided their investigation from the beginning. "You brought the good china," Mrs. Hill whispered, her voice thin but pleased as Eleanor unpacked 2 delicate teacups from her bag. "I thought the occasion deserved it," Eleanor replied, pouring the steaming tea. The familiar ritual, one they'd performed dozens of times in Mrs. Hill's cottage, felt sacred now. The elderly historian's hands trembled as she accepted the cup, but her memory remained crystal clear as she recounted final details about Ashford's reaction to Prudence's disappearance in 1878. Eleanor recorded every word, knowing these recollections would complete their archives. "You've done what I never could," the old woman said, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "You gave that poor girl back her name, her story." Her fingers, paper-thin and cool, squeezed with surprising strength. "My grandmother told me about Prudence when I was just a child. She made me promise never to forget." Eleanor fought back tears. "Your testimony made all the difference." Mrs. Hill nodded toward the window. "When you're my age, you stop fearing what people think. The truth matters more than reputation." She smiled faintly. "Tell Jacob and Maya they have an old woman's blessing for standing their ground." 3 days later, the historian slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, but the entire research team attended. Standing beneath black umbrellas as rain soaked the cemetery grounds, Jacob Moreno placed a blue ribbon, matching the one from Prudence's chamber, atop the casket. At the memorial reception, Maya Chu approached Eleanor with determination in her eyes. "I've been offered a position with the National Historical Preservation Society," she announced. "I'll be advocating for ethical handling of sensitive historical discoveries." Jacob joined them, his expression equally resolved. "And I've decided to focus my dissertation on historical advocacy, giving voice to those deliberately erased from records." He glanced at Eleanor. "You showed us that academic work can be more than just papers and tenure." Eleanor felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The 3 colleagues stood together by the window, watching as sunlight broke through the clouds over Wexford Estate in the distance. The grand house, visible on its hilltop, no longer looked forbidding. "From mausoleum to memorial," Eleanor murmured. Maya nodded. "Justice comes in many forms. Even if it takes 140 years, Jacob added quietly. The estate, once a vault of secrets, now stood as a beacon of remembrance, proof that no voice, however silenced, was truly lost forever. Golden autumn leaves spiraled through the restored corridors of Wexford Estate, dancing past the newly installed bronze plaque beneath Prudence's portrait. 1 year had transformed this place from a tomb of secrets to a sanctuary of remembrance. Eleanor Blackridge stood before the painting, studying the young woman's eyes that had haunted her dreams for months. The portrait, once sealed in darkness, now hung in the estate's main gallery, bathed in carefully designed lighting that brought warmth to Prudence's melancholy features. "I thought I might find you here," Jacob Moreno said, approaching with quiet footsteps. His dissertation on the Wexford discovery had earned him national recognition, but more importantly, it had given Prudence her rightful place in history. Eleanor smiled at her former student. "Just paying my respects before heading to the school presentation." The local elementary school had incorporated Prudence's story into their curriculum, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson about family, truth, and the importance of bearing witness. Children now walk these halls on field trips, their voices bringing life to rooms that had known only silence for generations. Maya Chu joined them, carrying a leather-bound book. "The final conservation report," she explained, handing it to Eleanor. "Every artifact, every document, preserved for future generations." The conservation expert had declined lucrative offers from prestigious museums to remain as the estate's permanent curator, ensuring Prudence's legacy would be protected. Through the tall windows, they could see visitors wandering the grounds, some leaving flowers at the small memorial garden where Prudence's remains had been properly reinterred. The legal battles with the Blackwell descendants had ended in compromise. The truth would be told, but with dignity rather than sensationalism. "Lillian called," Jacob mentioned. "Attendance numbers have exceeded projections. She's already planning next year's exhibition." Eleanor nodded, remembering how the museum director had eventually embraced their vision, finding a balance between institutional interests and ethical obligation. A school group entered the gallery, their teacher pointing to the portrait. "This is Prudence Wexford," she explained. "For almost 150 years, her story was hidden behind these walls." Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but it was different now. Not the panic attacks that had plagued her, but a fullness of purpose. Her connection to Catherine Blackwell had become not a burden, but a responsibility fulfilled. "Mrs. Hill would have loved this," Maya whispered, remembering the town historian whose final act had been cutting the ceremonial ribbon. Eleanor touched the blue velvet ribbon pinned to her lapel, identical to the one found in the secret chamber. "The house isn't silent anymore," she said. "It remembers." Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the estate's gardens, carrying not secrets, but stories finally free to be told.